I hope you're having a lovely day today. It was overcast and rainy all morning here this morning, and now it is beautiful and sunny out, and we've been outside. I wanted to share 2 homemaker things that I love so much that I could not leave home without, and that is 1, materials to make homemade laundry detergent, and 2, my sourdough starter. So starting with the laundry soap, last time that I came, I was still experimenting with soap bars to make laundry soap because I had gotten away from using Dr. Bronner's for values reasons because I don't want to support Dr. Bronner's. So I brought the Sapo Hill soap bar, and I really did not like using that in my laundry soap. I felt like it left residue on our clothes, and I just really didn't like it. We actually still had a half of a bucket of that I had kept in storage here. We dumped that out, and then I brought with us borax super washing soda and a quarter of a bar of my favorite laundry soap that I use, which is Caitlin's soap bar from Calico and Twine. I've done a whole video on how I make her laundry soap at home, but I just brought a quarter of all the ingredients because I only wanted to make a quarter of a bucket because we're only going to be here for a month. I brought all of those ingredients out, and I did that last time too, and I didn't have any problems with it. I just label it with my label maker. I just put it in my checked bag, and it didn't even look like it was messed with when we opened up our suitcases, which in the past, there have been times where we've brought stuff that they obviously poked into. One time we brought lotions with us to South Africa, and they were in these aluminum tubes, and they had opened one and squeezed it out, and then the other one they had stabbed something in it, and so you can usually tell when they rummage through the suitcase to look for things, and this time they didn't. So I had no trouble getting the ingredients over here within our first week of being here. That was one of my first projects. It was rainy here one day, so I thought that would be a perfect thing to get going, and so I dumped out the old batch, cleaned out that bucket, and then I went ahead and shredded that soap bar, and then once it's shredded, I put those shredded soap pieces in a pot with water over a stove, and then I melt the soap into the water. And while that is melting, I will then take the bucket to the bathtub. I add the borax powder, and then I add the super washing soda to the bucket, fill it up a quarter of the way with hot water, and then I add the melted soapy water to that, give it a good stir, put a lid on it, and let it sit there overnight. And at this point, we still didn't even have a washing machine at this house. So that was one of the first projects that we wanted to get done, was getting a washing machine for this house. So we ended up getting one on sale. It was originally 6,000 Rand, and then we got it for 4,300 Rand, which in dollars, that ends up being around $250, which is a really good deal. So we were pumped about that. Since I already had my laundry soap made, as soon as we installed it, the next day I did all of our laundry. We have a clothesline outside, so we've been able to hang our clothes out, and it is so nice. I love the smell of the homemade laundry soap. It makes your clothes smell so clean, especially after being on the clothesline all day. I just love it. So that is one thing that I cannot live without, is my homemade laundry soap. And then the second thing is my sourdough starter. So this process started when we were back home. I actually had 2 different starters going. I usually have my sourdough starter as a fresh milled flour sourdough starter. I wasn't sure how that was gonna do with drying it out. So last time we came, I didn't have a grain mill, so I just had a normal sourdough starter with store-bought flour. And I just spread out the starter on a baking sheet with parchment paper and a very thin layer, and after about 24 hours it dries up into these little crispy flakes. But this time I wasn't sure for some reason if it would work with a fresh milled flour starter, because it is with fresh milled flour, and that usually goes off. I have to feed our fresh milled flour starter every day, or at least every other day, or it ends up, you can tell, going, I don't want to say going off, but it starts getting brown because it has the endosperm in it. That's what's taken out of store-bought flour. So I didn't know if that would dehydrate well in the same way that the store-bought flour would, and so I wanted to do both. So I split my sourdough starter into 2 jars, one One, I kept it going with fresh milled flour. The other, I got it going with einkorn flour about a week before we left. And then 2 days before we left, I spread out both of the starters on parchment paper on the baking sheet and let it dehydrate overnight. And both of them did great. They were nice and crispy. And so I broke them up and put them into little brown bags and labeled them. And then I decided I was just going to bring the einkorn starter one with me, and I'm going to save the fresh milled one for when we get back. I do have a starter in the fridge, but I wanted a backup just in case. And then I brought the einkorn one with us here. And again, I didn't have any problems with it. I just put it in our snack bag in my backpack. I did that last time and didn't have any issues. And then once we went down the street, there is a bakery that sells their own wheat flour that they grow and harvest. And so I bought a bag of their stuff. And then when we were at the local market farm stall place, I saw that they had organic spelt flour that is stone ground. And so I thought I would use the spelt flour for my sourdough starter and then the bakery's flour for all of my baking. Once I got that, I was able to get my sourdough starter going again. To rehydrate it, I put 20 grams of the dried flaked sourdough starter into a little cup, and then I added 30 grams of water. I added room temperature water. Looking back, I should have made it warmer to maybe help dissolve it. So I just mixed it up, and then it still was kind of chunky, but I figured I would just let it sit and see what happened. So that was at noon, and we were gone all day until we got back at around 8:45 p.m. And when I checked it, it had definitely separated and it needed to be stirred. So I stirred it back up, and then I added 10 grams of warm water and 10 grams of the spelt flour and mixed it again really well, and then covered it, and I let it sit there overnight. The next morning, day 2 at 7:45, it had separated again overnight and needed to be mixed. And so I mixed it up, and then I let it sit there to see if there were going to be any bubbles, because that's how you can tell if it's active or not, is if you start getting bubbles. And I was getting just tiny little bits of bubbles, which made me excited because then I knew it was alive and active. At 10 a.m., I decided to feed it, and this time I added 20 grams of the spelt flour and 20 grams of warm water. And when I say warm water, it's about like warm to the touch. Now it is 9 p.m. and again, we were gone for most of the day. And so this is what it looked like at 9 p.m. It had risen a lot and was very bubbly. I was actually surprised at how bubbly it was, and it definitely needed to be stirred. I decided not to feed it because I just wanted to see how it did overnight because it already seemed to be so active. So by the next day, day 3, it is 8:30 in the morning, and again, it is very bubbly and active, but it had fallen down from the night before. To me, it was active. It was a good, ready to go sourdough starter. It was time to upgrade it to a larger container. So I thought that this cup was going to be big enough, so I went ahead, and this time I'm doing a full regular feeding just like I would any other time, which for me, I do equal parts sourdough starter, flour, and warm water. I know everyone has their own opinion with ratios, but for me, this is what I like doing for feeding the starter. I think it's easy and simple. So I just do a 1:1:1 ratio. I measured how much sourdough starter that I had, and I think it was around 120 grams. So I added 120 grams of warm water and 120 grams of spelt flour. And obviously the cup was too small, so I went and found another glass jar that I have. That's one blessing with every time we come here, I end up saving or collecting whatever jars that we buy and use things out of, and I save them so that way next time we come, I have plenty of storage jars or for things like this, my sourdough starter. So this jar worked out perfect for it, and I added everything into there, mixed it up really well, and then by 11:30 in the morning, the starter had already fully risen. Now it is summer here, so it's very warm, but I was amazed at how quickly activated this starter was. So I figured it is time to make bread. And so I followed my fresh milled sourdough recipe that I have on my blog that I used for back home. Now that I've done it, I definitely should have used less water. It ended up being a very wet sticky dough, which tasted fine and the consistency was fine once it was baked. It was just very hard to work with. So next time I will be adding less water for the ratios, but I will also link my recipe below. If you use fresh milled flour, for me it is a no fail, but for this recipe with this flour, it did not work great using those amounts. So I went ahead, added that to a bowl, and then I let it sit for 40 minutes, and then I used my spiral blender to mix it up. And then at this point is where the sourdough plan went out the window. Normally, after you mix it in 20-minute increments, 4 different times, you do the folds, and then you let it sit for about, I don't know, 2 to 4 hours, depending on the temperature. This is where things start to get very Africa-like. Whenever I'm in South Africa, I always say, blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be broken. We ended up having to leave, but I was like, oh, we'll be back. It's not a big deal. Well, we were back 7 hours later, because that's just how it is when we're here. We end up running into people, stopping off at places, visiting people, and 7 hours later, we get home, and I have not touched this dough ball once, and it had risen so much, it hit the towel that I had laid over it. And again, looking back, it's summer here, so it's warm, so it's gonna rise faster. It's a great time to be doing sourdough because it being warm, the sourdough starter thrives in that. Yeah, it was a very wet, sticky dough, so I tried working with it. I started doing my folds for a few times in the evening, and then I decided I was gonna put it in the refrigerator overnight. Hopefully that would slow down the fermenting process, and then in the morning I would bake the bread. So next morning, again, the sourdough has risen a ton overnight. I get it ready. I have this clay pot Dutch oven type of thing that I got here last time, that we got in an auction that I never used last time, but I wanted to try it this time, so I used that. And you're supposed to put it in the oven for 30 minutes and then an additional 10 minutes with the lid off. 15 minutes into baking, the electricity went out. Now, normally the electricity goes out here because there's this thing called load shedding. The government of South Africa is a mess, and they cannot maintain things and keep the electricity running here. So because of that, at different times, different regions of the country get their electricity turned off for 2 hours, and sometimes that's multiple times a day. But there is an app that tells you when your area's electricity is going to go off. So I could plan my day around when making bread, because the electricity was supposed to go off at 1 in the afternoon, but this was 8 in the morning and our electric went out as my bread is baking in the oven. I just had to laugh. I was like, this is Africa. This is what it's like being here. So yeah, it was, I guess, I don't even know why the electric went out. I don't know if, I mean, it was raining here, but it wasn't really storming. But it went out for about 30 minutes, so we didn't open the oven, we just let it sit in there. And then once the electricity came back on, we turned everything back on and restarted the time. Like, it had 15 minutes left with the lid on, so we left it in there, and then we took it out, took the lid off, put it back in, and yeah, so I had very low hopes for this bread. Everything that could go wrong in the process of making it pretty much went wrong. And despite everything that could go wrong going wrong, it still turned out delicious. The texture was great. The consistency was great. So I think that's a great start. So I'm excited to keep making more and playing around with the amounts. And of course, making other things with the sourdough starter. So yeah, that's the other thing. I have a lot of other things that I brought with me too. I brought all of my facial products and all of that stuff. So I could highlight a lot of other things that I brought from home, but these two were my 2 top homemaking items that I just love. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I bless you and the rest of your day.